The syringe was already halfway in. The sedative moved through Rex's bloodstream like cold water trickling through a cracked pipe, slow at first, then spreading, numbing the edges of everything. The fluorescent lights of the Harlow County Animal Control Facility buzzed overhead with the indifferent hum of a machine that did not know or care what it was witnessing. 3 staff members stood against the far wall of the isolation kennel, none of them willing to take another step toward the German shepherd chained in the corner. One held a catch pole that trembled slightly in his grip. Another had his hand resting on the butt of a tranquilizer gun. The third, the youngest, a boy of barely 22, had turned his face away entirely and was staring at the concrete floor as though he might find some kind of mercy written there. Rex weighed 91 pounds. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the base of his jaw, a souvenir from a roadside bomb detonation outside of Kandahar province, 3 years ago. He had been rated the top working dog in his unit for 2 consecutive deployment cycles. He had found 17 improvised explosive devices before they could detonate. He had dragged a wounded handler named Corporal Davis 40 yards through open fire until they reached cover. He had saved 12 lives, by official count, and probably more by every count that mattered. Now he was being put down for aggression. Dr. Sarah Chung, the shelter's 30-year-old veterinarian, stood over him with the syringe. She had done this before, more times than she liked to remember, and she had long since learned to keep her face neutral and her movements calm. She told herself it was humane. She told herself it was necessary. She had read his full case file twice. 14 documented incidents of aggression in the 18 months since his retirement. 3 handlers hospitalized. 1 lawsuit. The words extreme danger to public safety were stamped across the top of his paperwork in red ink. Still, her hand was shaking. Rex's amber eyes were fixed on her face. Not with hatred. She had seen hatred in dogs before, had learned to recognize it. This was something else. It was closer to the look of a soldier who has been cornered and has nothing left to lose. He was growling, low and continuous, a sound like distant thunder that never resolved into a storm. The chain around his neck was rated for 200 pounds of pull force. He had already snapped 2 previous chains. Dr. Chung pressed the plunger down another fraction of an inch. Then the heavy front door of the facility opened. It was the kind of door that required both hands and some momentum to push, solid steel, painted institutional gray, with a warning sign mounted at adult eye level that read "Authorized personnel only." It swung inward slowly, as though being opened by someone of very small stature. And indeed, the figure who stepped through it was small, very small. She was perhaps 7 years old, wearing a pink pajama top with a cartoon rabbit on the chest that was dirty at the collar and too thin for the November cold. Her feet were bare on the concrete floor. Her dark hair was unbrushed. Her eyes, large, brown, and absolutely empty of the kind of self-conscious awareness that most children carry, moved slowly around the room with the unhurried sweep of someone who had walked into a familiar place, not a terrifying one. No one spoke. The 3 staff members against the wall simply stared. The girl walked directly toward Rex. Hey, stop." The guard with the catch pole lurched forward, his voice cracking. "Get back. That animal will." He reached for her shoulder. She didn't flinch, didn't accelerate, didn't even register his presence. She just kept walking. Rex went silent. It happened so quickly that Dr. Chung almost missed it. One moment, there was the grinding, relentless thunder of his growl, the white flash of teeth, the rigid posture of a dog that has decided to take someone apart if they come 1 inch closer. And then the girl was 3 feet away, and Rex's entire body simply stopped. The growl died in his throat as though a switch had been thrown. His ears, which had been pinned flat in aggression, moved. First one, then the other, rotating forward with the careful precision of satellite dishes adjusting to a new signal. He lifted his nose. He was reading her. Every working dog is trained to do it, to use scent the way a doctor uses a stethoscope, to hear what the body is saying beneath its surface. What Rex found in the air around this small girl was something he had not encountered in 18 months of being afraid of the world. There was no aggression in her, no calculation, no hidden agenda, no flash of adrenaline that meant she was about to do something dangerous. There was only grief, pure, undefended, absolute grief, the kind that had been sitting inside her for so long that it had become indistinguishable from the person herself. Rex understood grief. It was the language he was most fluent in. He lowered his head, slowly, moving as though every joint in his body was asking permission from the one before it. He extended his muzzle toward the girl's open palm. His nose touched her skin. She stood completely still, not reacting, not withdrawing, not doing anything at all except existing within his radius. Then, with a sound that was not quite a whimper and not quite a sigh, Rex laid his massive head in her hand. The guard with the catch pole sat down heavily on the floor, as though his legs had simply decided they were no longer participating. Dr. Chung, the syringe still in her hand, felt something move through her chest that she couldn't name. It was not professional. She would think about it for years afterward, about what it meant that two broken things could recognize each other so completely, so instantaneously, across every barrier that should have separated them. She set the syringe down on the tray. Behind the girl, from the still open doorway, came the sound of running boots on pavement, and then a man's voice, hoarse, desperate, cracking around the edges with the specific terror of someone who has been looking for something precious and is terrified of what they will find. Lily, an old man appeared in the doorframe. He was 65, lean in the way that comes from a life of hard work rather than intention, with white hair and a veteran's posture that even age and heartbreak hadn't managed to erase entirely. He took in the scene before him. His granddaughter, a syringe on a tray, 91 pounds of ostensibly deadly German shepherd with its head resting in the small girl's hand, and his breath left him all at once. For the first time in 3 years, the girl named Lily was smiling. It was barely a smile, a slight upward movement at the corners of her mouth, the faintest unclenching of the permanent stillness that had settled over her face since the night her parents died. But Arthur Cole, retired staff sergeant, the last living member of his immediate family, the man who had been holding his granddaughter's silence like a stone in his chest for 12 months, saw it, and his eyes went red. He crossed the room. He crouched down until he was eye level with his granddaughter, and he looked at the dog, and then he looked at Dr. Chung. "How much?" he said, "to take him home?" Rex had not always been afraid of the world. That was the thing that none of his case file documents captured, and that none of the 3 handlers who had been hospitalized after him would ever think to mention. There had been a time when Rex was the most focused, disciplined, joyfully purposeful animal in the United States military working dog program. He had loved his work with the uncomplicated passion that only dogs and very certain kinds of people can bring to a purpose, wholly, without reservation, without the need to understand why. His handler then had been a young staff sergeant named Marcus Webb. Marcus had smelled like motor oil and spearmint gum, and the specific combination of fear and determined calm that the best handlers always carried. Rex had known the exact rhythm of Marcus's heartbeat at rest. He had known the particular way Marcus's body chemistry shifted when he was about to issue a command, a microsecond of heightened focus, barely detectable to a human observer, but to Rex as loud and clear as a starter pistol. They had been together for 3 years when the VBID detonated. Rex did not have a complete memory of the explosion itself. What he had instead was a collection of sensory fragments that ambushed him without warning. The pressure wave before the sound, a wall of displaced air hitting his chest, the specific high-frequency shriek of metal tearing, and then a silence so absolute that at first he thought he had died. He woke up in a field hospital with his left ear canal permanently damaged and Marcus's sent nowhere in the building. He waited for Marcus to come for 3 days before a woman in a white coat came instead. Marcus had not survived. The official designation was PTSD, and the official recommendation, after 14 months of rehabilitation attempts, was euthanasia. What the paperwork could not say was that Rex was not dangerous because he was broken. He was dangerous because he was still guarding something. In his fractured, grief-calcified mind, the threat was constant. Everyone who approached carried the potential to become the pressure wave. Every loud voice was a trigger. Every sudden movement was the half-second before impact. He attacked because attacking was the only vocabulary left to him for expressing the one sentence he needed to say. "I am still here, and I am not going to lose anyone else." That sentence was what Lily heard when she crossed the isolation room floor on bare, dirty feet and held out her hand. She heard it the way she heard most things in the world. Not with analysis or interpretation or the social filters that neurotypical children layer between themselves and raw experience, but directly, She had walked through the open emergency exit of the shelter's adjacent building while Arthur was signing intake forms for a stray cat bite, following a scent. Not of animal exactly, but of something she recognized without being able to name. The feeling that something alive was in pain, and that the pain was precisely the shape and weight of her own. She had been in pain for exactly 14 months. Since the night a vehicle with no plates and no lights had crossed the center line on County Road 7 and erased her parents from the world. In the days and weeks after the accident, the people around Lily had waited for her to cry, to grieve, to process. She had done none of these things. She had become still instead. Not the stillness of peace or acceptance, but the stillness of a pond that has frozen completely, where beneath the surface everything continues to move, but cannot be seen or reached. Her therapist called it traumatic mutism compounded by autism spectrum disorder. Arthur called it a locked door, and he knocked on it every day with the patient, persistent faith of a man who had learned from 30 years of military service that some things simply required you to keep showing up. The dog understood the locked door without being told. He could smell it on her the way he could smell old weather in a hillside, not present, but indelibly written into the ground. Dr. Sarah Chung spent the next 20 minutes watching Rex follow Lily's movements with his eyes, while the girls sat cross-legged on the kennel floor, not touching him, not speaking, simply being present in his radius. The growl did not return. The rigidity did not return. What returned instead was something Dr. Chung had begun to doubt Rex still possessed: the slow, soft relaxation of an animal that has decided, for the first time in a very long time, that it is safe to exhale. "I've never seen him do that," said the youngest staff member, still sitting on the floor. "Not once. Not with anyone." "Neither have I," said Dr. Chung. When Arthur finally led Lily toward the door, Rex rose from the floor and walked to the full length of his chain and stood there, watching them go. He made no sound, but the expression on his face, if a face so thoroughly canine could be said to carry an expression, was not aggression and not indifference. It was the look of a soldier watching his unit move out without him, and knowing, in whatever deep animal architecture serves as knowing, that the mission is not finished. Arthur stood in the doorway for a long moment. His granddaughter's hand was in his. He looked at the dog, and then he looked at Dr. Chung. "I want to do the paperwork," he said. "Whatever it takes. Whatever the liability forms say. I'll sign all of it." Dr. Chung looked at Rex. Rex looked at Arthur. Something passed between the old veteran and the old soldier that required no translation. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll have everything ready." The Cole farm sat at the end of a dirt road 3 miles outside of the town of Harlow, at the base of a long hillside that in summer was loud with birds and wildflowers, but in November wore a gray silence like a coat. It was 40 acres of rocky pasture, a barn that needed a new roof, a farmhouse that needed new everything, and a pair of apple trees in the yard that were the only things on the property that seemed entirely comfortable with their own existence. Arthur had bought it with his discharge pay 25 years ago, raised his son Daniel there, watched Daniel grow up and marry a woman named Claire and bring their daughter home from the hospital. He had planned to be buried there. He had not planned to be raising a 7-year-old with autism and traumatic mutism on a pension and the remains of a savings account that kept shrinking like a snowbank in March. Rex arrived on a Tuesday morning in the bed of Arthur's truck, sitting upright and facing backward, watching the road recede behind him with the alert, assessing posture of a soldier still on mission. He had allowed Arthur to load him with no resistance, had in fact walked to the truck and placed his front paws on the tailgate of his own accord, waiting with patient dignity to be helped up. Arthur had done the lifting without comment, favoring his bad hip, and they had ridden in silence that was somehow not uncomfortable. Lily was waiting on the porch steps when they arrived. She was wearing the same dirty pajama top, because she refused to change into anything else in cold weather, which was one of several battles Arthur had long since stopped fighting. She watched Rex jump down from the truck with the same empty-seeming attentiveness she brought to everything, watching a caterpillar on a leaf, watching clouds move, watching the particular way light changed on the floorboards in the late afternoon. But when Rex walked toward her, something shifted almost imperceptibly in her posture. A slight forward lean, a loosening of the hands that were usually pressed flat against her thighs. Rex stopped 2 feet away. He sat down and regarded her. Then he lay down, tucking his front paws neatly beneath his chest and rested his chin on his knee. An invitation without demand. Lily stepped off the porch and sat down next to him on the frozen ground. Arthur watched from the truck window and did not move for a long time. In the weeks that followed, a pattern established itself with the organic inevitability of something that had always been meant to be. Mornings, Rex would patrol the farm perimeter at first light, moving in the systematic search grid that had been drilled into his muscle memory across years of deployment, his damaged ear cocked sideways to compensate for the missing frequencies on his left side. He mapped the property the way a general maps a campaign, noting the gap in the fence line along the east pasture, the frozen creek bed that could be used for approach, the angle of sight lines from the barn to the house. He was not standing guard in any conscious strategic sense. He was simply being what he was, doing what his whole life had trained him to do, for the first time in 18 months without anyone trying to stop him. Afternoons belonged to Lily. She had taken to sitting beside him on the old porch rug, doing nothing that would have been legible to an outside observer. Not playing, not talking, not drawing. Simply existing alongside him in a mutual silence that was entirely unlike the silence of loneliness. Rex would occasionally lift his head and press it briefly against her knee, and she would occasionally reach over and rest her hand against his flank and feel his breathing. And this was their entire conversation, and it was sufficient. Nights were harder. Rex's nightmares came without warning and without mercy. He would be deep asleep on the old dog bed Arthur had installed in the corner of the kitchen, and then some sound. The creak of the house settling, a branch against the window, would catapult him back into Kandahar, and he would wake with a bark that shook the walls, legs scrambling, spinning to face a threat that existed only in the compressed terror of his memory. Arthur would come down the stairs in his bathrobe, talking to him in a low, even voice, the way you talk to someone standing on a ledge. Sometimes it worked quickly, sometimes it took half an hour. But on the nights when it was worst, when even Arthur's voice and Arthur's slow, careful approach could not reach him, on those nights, there would be the sound of small bare feet on the kitchen linoleum, and Lily would appear in the doorway in her rabbit pajamas, and she would cross the kitchen floor without hesitation, and she would sit down in the middle of the hurricane of Rex's terror and put her arms around his neck. And the nightmare would stop. Arthur never interfered with this ritual. He would stand in the doorway and watch his granddaughter hold the shaking dog until the shaking stopped, and he would think about his son Daniel, who had died still not knowing the truth about why the car that crossed the center line on County Road 7 had done so, and he would make himself not think it. Not yet. Not until he understood more. The farm was already 3 payments behind on its property tax. The bank had sent 2 letters. And last week, the county had sent a different kind of notice altogether, an official notice of pending for sale, signed by the Harlow County Sheriff's Department. Signed, specifically, by Sheriff Gerald Miller. Miller arrived on a Friday afternoon in his official vehicle, which he drove slowly up the dirt road in the way that powerful men drive slowly, as a demonstration that they are not in a hurry, because they do not need to be. He was 45, broad-shouldered, with the kind of handsome that requires consistent maintenance and shows its age badly when the maintenance lapses. He wore his uniform with the casual authority of a man who had been the largest thing in most rooms for a very long time. He carried a foil-covered dish that his secretary had prepared, which contained a casserole of undetermined origin that was intended to signal warmth and community concern. Rex heard the cruiser before it appeared at the tree line. His head came up from where he had been lying in a patch of thin November sunlight near the apple trees, and every muscle in his body assumed an alignment that had nothing to do with threat assessment in any consciously trained sense. It was older and more fundamental than training. It was the part of him that had spent years learning to read men, and that now read this one the way a fire reads oxygen, with absolute, irresistible recognition. The man smelled wrong. Not wrong in the obvious way of fear or aggression. Miller was far too composed for those particular chemicals to be detectable. It was more subtle than that. It was a wrongness layered beneath the cologne and the coffee and the official wool of the uniform. A particular combination of cortisol and the suppressed, habituated vigilance of someone who has been lying for a very long time and has become expert at it. Rex had smelled it before. In the field, the people who smelled like that were the ones who sent other people to die. He was on his feet and at the porch steps before Miller's boots hit the ground, and the sound coming out of his chest was the low, absolute warning of an animal that is not performing aggression, but simply informing you that it is present and that you should make your decisions accordingly. Miller stopped. He was good at hiding things, but something moved across his face. Not fear, precisely, but a recalibration. A recognition that the variable before him required a new calculation. "Impressive animal," he said pleasantly, to Arthur, who had come to the door. "He has good instincts," Arthur said. Miller smiled. It was a warm smile, practiced to a high degree of polish. He climbed the steps, placing each foot with the confident deliberateness of a man asserting territorial right, and Rex tracked every footfall with eyes that had once tracked moving targets across 300 meters of open desert terrain. When Miller extended his hand to Arthur, Rex stepped forward, not lunging, not barking, simply placing himself between Miller's extended arm and Arthur's body. Miller withdrew his hand. "Heard you took in the Harlow County attack dog." He laughed easily, as though sharing a joke they were all in on together. "That took some nerve, Arthur. Some real nerve. I hope you've got the liability sorted." "We're fine," Arthur said. "Well." Miller looked around the yard with the assessing gaze of a man pricing things. "I just wanted to come by personally, neighbor to neighbor. I know times have been hard since Daniel and Claire." He let a pause carry the appropriate weight of sorrow, timed with the precision of a man who has used it many times. "The county tax situation isn't something I have a lot of control over. I want you to know that. But there are people who've expressed interest in this land. Fair people. Reasonable offer. It might be worth hearing them out. No pressure, of course." "No pressure," Arthur repeated. "No pressure." Miller held up a hand in the gesture of a reasonable man. "I just want what's best for you and little Lily. That's all any of us want." Rex's growl had dropped below the range that human ears could easily track, into a frequency that was felt in the chest more than heard, a vibration that communicated something older and more elemental than any word for warning. Miller glanced at the dog. Something in his eyes shifted briefly, like sunlight moving across ice, and was gone. He left the casserole on the porch railing and drove away. That night, Arthur sat at the kitchen table for a long time after Lily was in bed. He thought about the things he had noticed since coming back to the farm 14 months ago, after the accident. The way the eastern fence line had been cut and remended, not recently, but perhaps 2 or 3 years ago. The old deadfall at the far edge of the property, near the creek, where someone had cleared a small area and then let it regrow. The fact that Daniel, in the months before his death, had been strange on the phone, careful in a way he had never been before, asking oblique questions about the property line, about survey records, about who owned the timber rights to the adjacent county land. Arthur had been a soldier long enough to know when someone was circling something they weren't ready to name out loud. He looked at Rex, who was lying beside Lily's chair with his head on his paws, watching Arthur with eyes the color of old amber. "You know something, don't you?" Arthur said. Rex blinked once, slowly, which was as close as he ever came to answering a question directly. It was the smell that led him there. It was always the smell. On the 3rd Sunday after his arrival, Rex was running the eastern perimeter, the section nearest the old creek bed, where the deadfall formed a natural windbreak and the ground was perpetually soft from the underground spring that fed the pasture. He had run this section a dozen times without incident. But on this particular morning, something had shifted in the scent landscape, as though a door had been opened somewhere underground. The temperature had dropped 6 degrees overnight, and cold air contracts and moves differently than warm air, drawing buried things upward through the soil the way a pump draws water from deep strata. Rex stopped at the base of the largest of the deadfall logs. He stood motionless for 11 seconds, a trained pre-indication pause, and then he began to dig. He had been trained on explosives, on drugs, on human remains. What he was digging toward was none of these things, exactly. It was metal and aged rubber and something that had the faint, specific chemical signature of magnetic storage media. He dug with the complete, unself-conscious commitment of an animal that has been given a task and intends to complete it, sending frozen earth flying in rhythmic arcs, going deeper as the cold surface layer gave way to the softer, root-tangled soil beneath. The box was 8 inches down. It was an old military-style ammunition case. The olive-drab paint rusted to brown. The rubber seal on the lid deteriorated but intact enough to have protected the contents. Rex indicated by sitting and barking 3 times. his formal alert, the signal he had used for 3 years to tell Marcus that he had found the thing. Arthur found him there an hour later. During the morning walk he took every day regardless of weather, the habit of a man whose body still remembered the rhythms of early reveille. He saw Rex sitting beside a disturbed patch of earth with the formal posture of a dog who has completed his assignment. He crouched down and brushed the remaining dirt from the box's surface. His hands had steadied over the years past the tremor they had developed in his 50s. They were steady now, which surprised him. He carried the box to the kitchen table and opened it carefully with a flathead screwdriver because the latch mechanism had rusted completely. Inside, a waterproof notebook, a USB drive in a sealed plastic bag, and 3 photographs. Arthur recognized the handwriting in the notebook immediately. It was Daniel's, the neat, slightly leftward-leaning script of a left-hander who had been taught to write right-handed in the 2nd grade. He read for 40 minutes without moving, occasionally turning pages with the care of someone handling something fragile. When he finished, he sat still for a long time. Daniel had not been a man who sought trouble. He had been an accountant, a careful man, a man who double-checked his arithmetic and renewed his car registration 90 days early. But he had been an accountant who did volunteer bookkeeping for the Harlow County Community Development Office. And what he had found in those accounts, 18 months before the accident, was a set of transactions that led, with the patient, accumulating logic of a ledger, to the Harlow County Sheriff's Department receiving payments from a distribution network that moved fentanyl through the rural corridor between 2 state capitals. The payments were routed through shell entities connected to property development projects. The development projects all required the acquisition of specific parcels of land. One of those parcels was the coal farm. The USB drive contained a copied set of bank records and a folder of photographs, several of which showed Gerald Miller's official cruiser parked outside a warehouse that the shipping manifest in the notebook identified as a distribution hub. Daniel had been collecting this evidence for 6 months before the accident. He had been too frightened, too uncertain of who to trust, to go to any authority. He had been planning to contact the FBI field office in the capital. He had put the box in the ground as insurance, in case something happened to the copies he kept at home. Something had happened to more than the copies. Arthur closed the notebook. He thought about the accident report, which he had read many times. The report that described a hit and run on a stretch of County Road 7 that had no working traffic cameras, involving a vehicle never identified, on a night when the dispatch log showed 3 cruisers in the area, but none of them assigned to that sector. He thought about the form he had signed 3 months after the accident, under considerable administrative pressure, waiving the right to further investigation given insufficient evidence of criminal intent. He thought about who had personally delivered that waiver form to the house for his signature, Gerald Miller, who had expressed his condolences warmly and driven away. Arthur's hand went to the notebook. He was reaching for his phone, reaching for the FBI field office number he had looked up 6 months ago for reasons he hadn't fully acknowledged to himself, when he heard a sound from the direction of the barn, not an animal sound. The specific dull resonance of a car engine with its lights off, moving slowly over gravel in the way that people move when they don't want to be heard. Rex was already at the back door, every hair on his spine standing vertical, the warning in his throat vibrating at the frequency below human language. He had been wrong about one thing. Miller had not simply been circling the property today. He had been watching it, and now he had seen Rex digging. They came at 2 in the morning. There were 3 of them, plus Miller, who waited in the cruiser at the tree line with the engine running. The 3 men wore plain clothes and moved with the practiced silence of men who had done this kind of thing before. Not professional, exactly, but experienced, which in rural dark is often sufficient. They cut the perimeter wire at the eastern fence line and came across the east pasture in a line, moving low. Rex met them at the barn. The noise that followed woke Arthur before any alarm could have. The specific sound of Rex in full engagement, a sound that was entirely unlike the PTSD-triggered aggression that had filled 14 months of incident reports. This was not a frightened animal. This was a working dog doing the work he had been built and trained and purposed to do, with every faculty intact and deployed. He fought with the systematic, controlled violence of a trained military working dog, targeting the forearm, breaking the grip, releasing, repositioning, targeting again. He put 2 of the 3 men on the ground before the third connected a boot with his ribcage. Arthur came through the back door with a flashlight and a raised voice. And for a brief, chaotic moment, the darkness was full of shouting and the sound of men scrambling to their feet and Rex barking orders in the only language available to him. One of the men grabbed the ammunition case from where Arthur had left it on the porch railing. Another grabbed Arthur by the collar and drove him into the doorframe hard enough to crack his head against the wood. Arthur's knees buckled. In the confusion, no one saw Lily standing in the upstairs window. She had heard Rex's voice change, not the nightmare bark, something else entirely, something that vibrated at a frequency she felt in her sternum, and she had come to the window and stood there in the thin light, watching. Miller had stepped out of the cruiser at the tree line and was watching too, which meant he saw Arthur go down, and he saw the case recovered, and he saw Rex, bleeding from the boot kick, but still on his feet, still interposing himself between the retreating men and the fallen Arthur. Miller was not a man given to improvisation, but he was very good at reading a situation and identifying the action that would most efficiently resolve it to his advantage. He picked up his radio and called it in himself. By morning, every deputy in the county had been notified that the dangerous military dog at the Cole farm had attacked 3 citizens and hospitalized 1. Miller arrived personally with documentation to serve a formal order permitting the dog's immediate lethal removal. He was sympathetic, naturally. He was sorry it had come to this. He helped Arthur up off the porch step with a hand under the elbow and expressed his genuine sadness at the situation while 2 of his deputies deployed the catch poles. Rex fought the poles with everything he had left. He bit through the first cable before they managed to cinch the second. He did not hurt anyone. He simply would not stop until the voltage from the taser dropped him. Lily had come downstairs at some point in the proceedings. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched them drag Rex toward the animal control van. Her face was what it always was, empty to anyone who didn't know how to read it. But Arthur, being lifted into an ambulance with a head wound and 2 cracked ribs, looked at his granddaughter's face and saw something he hadn't seen there in over a year. Not emptiness. Terror. "I'll get him back," he said to her, which was almost certainly a lie, but was the only thing he could think of to say that was true to what he intended. He did not know then that Miller had already made a separate call, one that did not go through official dispatch channels, arranging for Lily to be picked up from a neighbor's house by a county social services officer, pending evaluation of Arthur's fitness as a guardian given the safety incident, or that the social services officer was on Miller's payroll, or that the evaluation would not be conducted at any county facility. The blizzard came in from the northwest in the late afternoon, the kind of storm that the Weather Service had been tracking for 3 days and that still managed to arrive faster and harder than anyone was ready for. By 6 o'clock, visibility on the county roads was down to 30 feet and the temperature had dropped to -22 with wind chill. Miller had chosen the location carefully. The abandoned Fenwick logging camp was 11 miles into the state forest, accessible in summer by a fire road that was now completely unpassable. In winter, the only way in or out was on foot, and in a blizzard of this magnitude, a small child left in an unheated structure would simply go to sleep. It would look like a tragedy. A disturbed child wandered off in a storm. The autistic granddaughter of an incapacitated old man who had demonstrated, very publicly that very morning, that he could not maintain a safe home environment. He had left 2 men there, in a truck park just inside the tree line, to make sure the night resolved as planned. Rex was in a catch cage in the Harlow County Animal Control van when the storm front hit. The driver had pulled over to wait it out, which meant Rex could hear the wind and smell the shift in the air that told him, with the specificity of a trained weather instrument, that something serious was coming. He also, beneath the smell of the storm, could detect something else, faint, distance degraded, but absolutely present. The specific combination of lavender soap and something sweeter, something organic and undefended, that he had cataloged and memorized from the first moment Lily had held out her hand to him. She was in that storm. She was miles away, and the scent was a ghost of itself, barely there, but Rex's nose was not a human nose. It was a tool calibrated by years of work to find the specific among the general at extreme range, and what it told him now was not ambiguous. He broke the first latch mechanism with his teeth. The second took longer and cost him a torn gum and 2 chipped incisors. The cage door swung open into the dark interior of the van. The van's rear doors were not secured from the inside. A standard cage transport van, designed to prevent animals from operating the interior, had no mechanism for preventing an animal who had freed itself from the cage from simply leaning on the door handle with its full body weight. The doors swung open into the blizzard. Rex hit the road at a full run and did not slow down. The cold was a physical thing, not an abstraction. It hit the moisture in his eyes and crystallized it, reduced his already damaged hearing further, packed into the cut along his ribcage, and turned it from pain into something past pain, which is a different and worse category of sensation. The wind came at him in irregular surges, each one a separate attempt by the world to push him sideways off his line. He ran through it with his head low and his nose working continuously, a biological navigation instrument locked to a signal 11 miles away. He ran for 2 hours. There is a kind of endurance that training produces and a different, harder kind that love produces, and Rex was operating on the second kind now. His battle-damaged back leg, which had never fully healed from the Kandahar shrapnel, began to fail him at the 3-mile mark, a slow deterioration of the muscle groups that stabilized his stride, forcing him into a 3-legged loping movement that was inefficient and painful, and that he continued anyway, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping was not a concept that his mind or body was currently capable of entertaining. The scent grew stronger as the miles accumulated. It changed in texture as it grew closer. Fear now, and cold. The cold in someone's breath when the core temperature is starting to drop. He had found people hypothermic before in training scenarios. He knew the smell of a body beginning to conserve its resources at the expense of the extremities. He had found them in time, and he had found them too late. And he knew the difference between those two smells, and what he was tracking now was still on the side of time. He ran faster. The Fenwick logging camp appeared at the edge of his failing vision as a dark geometry of shapes against the white chaos of the storm. A main building, 2 outbuildings, a rusted equipment shed. He read the wind geometry as he approached, identifying the positions of the 2 men in the truck by the plume of exhaust from the idling engine and the faint chemical signature of their body heat in the cold air. He adjusted his approach line, moving through the trees on the upwind side, which was not the most efficient route to the main building, but was the route that kept him invisible. He went for Lily first. She was in the main building, in the far corner, curled into herself on a concrete floor in an attitude that his training recognized immediately as someone who had gone beyond active distress into the dangerous passivity of severe cold. She was conscious, barely, her eyes open when he pressed his nose to her cheek, and her hand moved, finding his fur by instinct and gripping it. He lay down against her and pressed the full length of his body to hers, wrapping himself around her as completely as his dimensions allowed, and the heat of him, the tremendous metabolic furnace of a large working dog at exertion, still blazing even after 2 hours in a blizzard, began its work. He heard the men leave the truck 4 minutes later. They came through the main door with their flashlights before them, which was a tactical error. Rex had been in darkness for 2 hours. He knew the interior of the building as thoroughly as any space he had ever cleared. The angle of the doorframe, the location of the rusted equipment that would complicate movement, the support pillars 6 feet from the entrance that created a natural cover position. He had mapped it in the 60 seconds between his arrival and the sound of the truck doors opening. When the first flashlight came through the door, Rex was not where Lily was. He was 7 feet to the right and 11 feet back, still against the wall, below the sweep of the beam. The first man stepped fully inside and swept his light left, then right, then stopped. "She's in the back corner," he said. "Where's the dog?" said the second man, still in the doorway. The first man's flashlight came up and swept toward the corner. Rex was already moving. He took the first man from behind and below, targeting the back of the knee, not the throat, not the arm, because he needed the man on the floor without injury sufficient to fire a weapon, which required a different targeting calculation than full combat engagement. The man went down with a surprised shout, his flashlight skidding across the concrete. Rex released, repositioned, and was between the second man and Lily before the second man had fully processed what had happened to the first. The second man raised a hunting rifle. Rex did not charge him. He went sideways instead, into the darkness to the second man's left, moving in complete silence. The man turned the rifle, tracking where he thought Rex would be. Rex was already behind the support pillar. The report of the rifle in the enclosed space was catastrophic. It hit his damaged ear like a second explosion, a flash of white static that momentarily stripped him of his hearing entirely, leaving him in a silence that was familiar in the worst possible way. He felt himself beginning to fragment, felt the edges of the Kandahar memory pressing in, the pressure wave, the disappearance of sound, the world tilting. And then he heard something, not through his ears, through his feet, through the vibration of the concrete floor. The small, familiar percussion of Lily's heartbeat, 32 feet away, in the corner where he had left her. He came out of the PTSD fragment with the abruptness of a man pulling himself hand over hand back from the edge of a cliff, and he was on the second man before the rifle came level again. He hit the wrist, exactly on the joint, at the angle that his training had burned into his nerve memory as the most efficient path to inducing an involuntary release. The rifle hit the floor. The man hit the floor behind it, screaming. Rex stood over him for 1 second, long enough to establish the status of the engagement, and then went back to Lily. He sat beside her. He was shaking, and the shaking was not entirely from the cold. He was bleeding from somewhere he couldn't identify, a slow and serious bleed that he could smell on himself, warm against the cold air. His back like had stopped working properly somewhere in the last 10 minutes, and was now simply refusing to bear weight. He pressed his head against Lily's shoulder. She had not moved from her curled position, but her hand found his ear and held it with a grip that was, for a 7-year-old in the advanced stages of hypothermia, remarkably strong. They stayed that way while the storm did what storms do, continued, indifferently, being what it was. Miller came personally. He was not the kind of man who delegated the supervision of loose ends. He came through the door at 20 minutes after midnight, with a heavy flashlight and a .357 revolver that was not his service weapon. He saw his 2 men, one on the floor nursing a wrist, and one sitting against the wall with an expression of a man reassessing his career choices. He swept the flashlight toward the back corner and found them, the child and the dog, a dark wet stain spreading beneath Rex's hindquarters that the flashlight illuminated with clinical precision. Miller raised the revolver. Rex rose. He should not have been able to. The physics of the situation, the blood loss, the leg, the cold, the accumulated damage of a night that had asked more of him than any reasonable accounting of his remaining resources could have provided, argued against it. But Rex rose, placing himself between Miller and the corner, and the sound that came out of him then was not the warning growl of a dog that hopes to dissuade. It was something without a human analogy, the sound of an entity that has decided, with complete and irreversible clarity, that the thing behind it will not be reached regardless of cost. Miller hesitated. It was a very brief hesitation. He was not a man who hesitated often, but it was there. He had grown up around dogs. He knew the difference between a dangerous dog and a dog that had made a final decision. The distinction frightened him, which was an unfamiliar sensation, and it made him angry, which was a much more familiar one. "You are a dog," Miller said, almost to himself, with a kind of genuine bewilderment. He took a step forward. Rex charged. He covered 11 feet on a failing leg at an angle that took Miller's gun hand rather than his center mass, because Rex was still, even now, a trained working dog executing the engagement protocols that had been his life's architecture, and the protocol for an armed suspect was always the weapon hand first. He hit Miller's wrist and felt something give, not a clean break, but a dislocation that was sufficient to separate the man from the revolver. And then Miller's other fist connected with Rex's ribcage where the kick had already done its work, and Rex felt something creak in a way that things should not creak, and his legs buckled. He did not fall completely. He caught himself on 3 legs and turned, positioning himself again, bleeding on the concrete floor, his breathing visible in the flashlight beam as rapid, shallow plumes of vapor. He was not going to be able to do this again. He understood that with the clear, undramatic recognition of an animal that has no mechanism for self-deception. He had one more charge available to him, perhaps at reduced speed, against a man who was now holding his injured wrist to his chest and reaching with his other hand for the revolver on the floor. The front door of the logging camp came off its hinges. It came off with the specific percussion of a door hit by a battering ram, followed by the sound of boots on concrete and voices at high volume, and then the white-blue sweep of tactical flashlights that are a very different instrument than the civilian kind. Rex's hearing was gone on his left side and reduced on his right, but he felt the vibration of multiple heavy boots, and he smelled the specific combination of cold night air, body armor nylon, and state police issue weapon oil. He also smelled, behind the tactical team, two other scents. The particular combination of old coffee and pine tar soap that was Arthur Cole, and the clean, familiar smell of Dr. Sarah Chung. Miller was face down on the floor with two troopers on him before he had completed the movement toward the revolver. Arthur Cole, who had been discharged from Harlow General Hospital against his physician's strong objections 5 hours earlier, who had spent 3 hours on a phone with the state police field commander presenting Daniel's evidence from a copy of the USB drive that he had made 2 weeks prior, in a moment of the kind of instinct that 3 decades of military service leaves a man with. Arthur Cole crossed the room and knelt down next to his granddaughter and put his arms around her and held her without speaking. Rex lay down beside them. He had done the math, somewhere in the part of him that runs the numbers without being asked, and the numbers said that the bleeding needed to stop very soon. He allowed Dr. Chung to put pressure on the wound with both hands. He had never allowed a medical professional to touch him without resistance, and he registered, in some distant way, that this was a change, and he rested his chin on his paws and looked at Lily. Lily was looking at him. She was blue around the mouth and her eyes were unfocused from the cold, but they were tracking him. She had never in 14 months looked at anything the way she looked at him now, with focus that was not the flat, sensory cataloging focus of her baseline state, but with something acute and urgent and terrified. Something that looked like the face of a person who is about to lose something they cannot live without. "He's still with us," Dr. Chung said, to no one in particular, compressing the wound with the focused efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is not entertaining its alternatives. "But I need to get him to a clinic. Right now." The veterinary clinic in Harlow was not equipped for what Rex needed, so Dr. Chung drove 60 miles through the tail end of the storm to the University Animal Hospital where she had done her residency, calling ahead on the highway with the precise, clipped efficiency of a doctor who knows how to use the phone to get things done at 3 in the morning. Rex rode in the back of her SUV with his head in Lily's lap and Arthur's hand on his flank, and Arthur talked to him the whole way in the low, steady voice that he had been using for weeks, talking about the farm and the apple trees and the spring that would come, talking about everything and nothing, the way you talk to someone you are asking to stay. Rex listened. He was not able to do much else. The cold had done something to his ability to sustain the processing of complex environmental information, which was a strange kind of peace. The world reduced to the immediate. The warmth of Lily's legs beneath his head, the pressure of Arthur's hand, the sound of a voice that was talking to him, as though he were worth talking to. The surgery took 4 hours. Arthur and Lily sat in the waiting room of the University Animal Hospital while the fluorescent lights did what fluorescent lights do at 4 in the morning, maintained their indifferent brightness at a pitch that is slightly too high for comfort. Arthur had a bandage around his head and a sling he kept removing, and Arthur drank terrible vending machine coffee, and Lily sat beside him in a borrowed hospital blanket, her legs pulled up on the waiting room chair. She had not moved or spoken since they had left the logging camp. She was inside herself again, back behind the locked door, or so it appeared from the outside. Arthur sat beside her and did not push. He knew, from 14 months of practice, that what you offered in those moments was presence, simply being there, not requiring anything. The surgery doors opened at 6:12 in the morning. Dr. Chung came through them in scrubs, her face carrying the specific expression of a doctor who has something to tell you and who has decided to lead with the thing that will allow you to keep breathing. "He's out," she said. "He's stable. He lost more blood than I'd like, and the leg is going to need time. There was new damage on top of the old shrapnel injury. He'll have a permanent limp." She paused. "But he's going to be fine." Arthur put his face in his hands. His shoulders moved. He didn't make any sound. Lily was already on her feet. "Not yet," Dr. Chung said gently. "He's still in recovery. We can't." "Please," Arthur said, from behind his hands. Dr. Chung looked at him. She looked at the small girl standing beside him in a hospital blanket, her bare feet on the waiting room linoleum, Her face pointed toward the surgery doors with an expression that was entirely unlike the blankness that everyone who knew her had learned to accept as simply who she was. What was on her face now was something Dr. Chung would have a difficult time describing for years afterward when she told this story. It was not one thing. It was the face of someone whose entire interior world is pressing against the glass. She stepped aside. Rex was in a recovery bay on a raised heated surface, with 2 IVs and monitoring equipment reading his vitals in green lines. He was deeply sedated, post-surgical, still under the tail end of the anesthesia. His coat was shaved in 3 places, showing bandaged incisions. His back leg was wrapped and elevated. He looked, in the specific way of large dogs in medical settings, both formidable and heartbreakingly fragile. Lily went to him. She placed both hands on his chest, over his heartbeat, and stood there. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then something passed across her face, a tremor, beginning at the corners of her mouth and moving inward, like ice fracturing from the center. Her breath changed. Her shoulders came up and then collapsed, and the sound that came out of her was not a child's cry in any conventional sense. It was the sound of something that has been locked in a very small space for a very long time, finally being given a door large enough to move through. It was 3 years of accumulated silence, and it was the specific terror of the night, and it was love in a form that had not yet found its language, but was finding it now, word by first agonized word. She pressed her face into the fur at Rex's neck. "Don't die," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse, cracked and small, and the most real thing in the room. "Please, don't die." A pause in which the monitors beeped steadily, and outside the storm was ending. "My dog." Rex's ear moved. The undamaged one, the right one, rotating toward her voice with the precision of an instrument calibrated for exactly this frequency. His tail, slow, laborious, defying the sedation and the blood loss and the physics of a body that had given most of what it had, moved. Once, against the surface of the recovery table, Arthur Cole, standing in the doorway in a head bandage and a borrowed hospital shirt, made a sound he would deny making for the rest of his life. Dr. Sarah Chung, 30 years old, who had gone into veterinary medicine because she believed that every animal deserved to be treated as though its life had weight, sat down in the corridor outside the recovery bay and finally, after a very long night, allowed herself to cry. Spring came to Harlow in the way that spring comes to places that have had a hard winter, slowly, apologetically, and then all at once, in a rush of color and sound that made the preceding months seem like something that had happened to a different world. Gerald Miller was arraigned on charges that included second-degree murder, trafficking, corruption, evidence tampering, kidnapping, and conspiracy, among others. The evidence from Daniel Cole's ammunition case, supplemented by the state police investigation that had been pending on Miller's network for 8 months, and that had lacked exactly the kind of documented linkage that Daniel's records provided, was sufficient to produce a case that the county district attorney described, in a press statement, as comprehensive. Miller's 2 men from the logging camp plea bargained. Miller himself did not, which his public defender noted was consistent with the profile of a man who had never in his adult life fully absorbed the concept that his actions had consequences. He was convicted on all primary counts and sentenced to life without parole. The Cole farm came off the for sale list when the investigation revealed that the tax delinquency had been manufactured, a set of payments made by Arthur that had been redirected by a deputy clerk on Miller's payroll and recorded as unpaid. The county restitution process took 4 months and produced a check that Arthur used to fix the barn roof and establish a savings account for Lily's education. Rex came home in March, 10 weeks after the logging camp. He came home with a slight lisp to his gait, the permanent limp that Dr. Chung had warned them about, a consequence of the re-injured back leg that no amount of surgical skill and rehabilitation could entirely resolve. He also came home with a scar on his ribcage and a new entry in the paperwork that Arthur had framed and hung on the wall of the kitchen, between a photograph of Daniel and Claire on their wedding day and the American flag that had been given to Arthur at his own retirement. A formal commendation letter from the state police, recognizing Rex as the primary instrumental factor in the resolution of the Miller investigation and the rescue of a minor child. The letter used the word valor, which was a word Arthur had not seen on a document since his own service record, and which he felt was entirely appropriate. Rex received the framing of his commendation with the impassive dignity of a dog who has never required external validation of his worth and is not about to start needing it now. He inspected every room of the farmhouse upon his return, updating his mental map for the changes that 10 weeks had produced: a new rug in the kitchen, a slightly different arrangement of the furniture in the living room, the specific smell of spring mud coming in under the back door. He made a full perimeter check of the property, limping steadily through the thawing pasture, noting the places where the frost heave had shifted the fence posts. He filed all of this information and returned to the porch, where Lily was sitting on the steps in the thin March sunlight. She was talking, not continuously, not easily, not the way a child who has never been silent talks. Her speech had the careful quality of something being rebuilt, each sentence considered, each word selected with the slight pause of a craftsman choosing a tool. But she talked. She told Rex about the things that had happened at school, about the 2 girls in her class who had let her eat lunch with them on 3 occasions, about the teacher who had a fish tank in the back of the classroom with a fish named Gerald, which Lily had decided was extremely funny. She talked to Rex the way she had always communicated with him, not requiring response, not monitoring for the social feedback that exhausted her in human interactions, simply speaking into the safe space of his attention. Rex lay down at her feet and listened with his right ear tilted toward her, which was the only reliable listening ear he had left, and this arrangement seemed to suit them both perfectly. Arthur watched them from the kitchen window, drinking his coffee. The apple trees in the yard had their first buds, tight, green, tentative, the way all new things are tentative at the beginning. He thought about Daniel, as he did every morning. He thought about Claire. He thought about the fact that grief does not end, exactly, but that it can be, given sufficient time and company, incorporated, made part of the structure of a life rather than the whole of it. He thought this was probably what therapists meant when they used the word healing, which had always sounded to him like something that happened to wounds and not to people, but which he was beginning to reconsider. Lily stood up from the steps. She had a yellow plastic flying disc in her hand, a gift from the physical therapist who worked with her twice a week, who had suggested outdoor play as a part of her sensory integration practice. She looked at Rex. Rex looked at the disc with the alert, forward-focused attention of an animal who recognizes an object associated with an enjoyable activity. "Rex," Lily said. Rex's ears swiveled. Both ears, actually. Even the damaged left one made its incomplete attempt, the mechanical ghost of the gesture. Lily threw the disc. She threw it in the way of a small child who has not yet learned to throw. Too high, slightly left, spiraling unevenly toward the far end of the yard where the apple trees were standing in their new bud readiness. Rex was already moving before it reached the apex of its arc, the permanent limp translated by speed and purpose into something that was not quite a graceful gait, but was absolutely a joyful one. 3-legged loping across the April-thawed ground with his ears back, and his eyes tracking the yellow disc against the pale blue of the morning sky. He caught it at the base of the apple tree. He turned and came back toward Lily at the same 3-legged lope, the disc held in his jaws with the delicate precision of a dog that has been trained to retrieve without damage, his tail in full revolution, his eyes on her face with an expression that was, if you were willing to accept that the architecture of a dog's face could carry such things, and Arthur Cole was entirely willing. The purest and most uncomplicated form of happiness available to any creature that has come through the dark and found, on the other side of it, something worth coming back for. Lily was laughing. It was the first time Arthur had heard that sound in 3 years and 4 months, and it was the smallest, most ordinary sound imaginable, a child's laugh, high and unself-conscious, triggered by nothing more than a dog running across a yard with a yellow disc. It required no context and no explanation. It was simply what it was, proof that the door could be opened, that the frozen pond could thaw, that the things that seemed irrevocably lost were sometimes only deeply buried, waiting for the right excavation. Rex dropped the disc at Lily's feet and sat before her with his imperfect posture and his scarred coat and his amber eyes that had seen things most dogs and most people will never see, and waited to be thrown for again. She picked up the disc and threw it. He ran. In the kitchen window, Arthur Cole finished his coffee. Outside, the apple trees were coming into bud. Behind the farmhouse, the creek that ran along the eastern pasture was moving again after its winter freeze, carrying the snowmelt down through the dark soil and into the lowland where the wildflowers would be in another 4 weeks. The yellow ones that Claire had loved and that Lily had begun, recently, to mention by name. The world was not fixed. It was never simply fixed, but it was moving, and it was spring, and in the yard a limping dog and a laughing girl were doing the only thing that is ever really required of any living thing that has survived what it wasn't supposed to survive. They were still here, and they were still running, and the sun was warm on the ground, and that was enough. That was, in all the ways that finally matter, absolutely everything. He had saved 12 lives, by official count. The 13th was harder to document, because it was not a single act but 1,000 small ones, a head laid in a hand, a body pressed against a shivering child in the dark, a failed leg that kept moving anyway. The 13th life was a 7-year-old girl who had gone somewhere no one could reach her. And he had found her there, the way he had always found the things no one else could find, not by being clever, but by being faithful, by following the scent of grief to its source and refusing to leave. Her name was Lily. She called him her dog. He had been many things in his life, a weapon, a tool, a threat, a patient, a burden, but this, at last, was the name that fit. Her dog, his girl, they were, in the end, each other's.